All right, let's do a really interesting autopsy of the Kari Lake run in Arizona. Did she lose because she was extreme, or did she lose for other reasons? And what does it portend for the Republican Party and American politics? To help us break it down is Isaac Stanley-Becker. He wrote an interesting piece about it in the Washington Post. Isaac, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
No problem. So I think there's a couple of interesting things in your piece that are bigger than this story, and I'm going to come back to. But first, let's stay on Kari Lake. So she lost her race by 17,000 votes, as you explained in your article. But the state treasurer, I believe, for the Republicans, Kimberly Yee, outperformed her by 120,000 votes. So that pretty much, I've got an example of that just like that out of Georgia in the Herschel Walker versus Brian Kemp. But doesn't that pretty conclusively prove that the extreme candidates are clearly doing worse in the general elections for Republicans?
I'm so glad that you mentioned this data point. When we came across this in the election results, we thought that this was just an amazing detail about Republican voters showing up to the polls, voting for at least some Republican candidates, but spurning those at the top of the ticket, in this case, whom they found to just be too extreme. And so I think that the point you make is apt here, that there were policies that people found reason to support for Kimberly Yee, the candidate for state treasurer, who emphasized sort of pocketbook issues, financial literacy, fiscal discipline, but they did not want to vote for a candidate who denied the results of elections.
Yeah, and in the case of Georgia, it was an 8.5 point difference between the voters who voted for Brian Kemp versus the ones that voted for Herschel Walker. So that 8.5 points obviously critical and cost the Republicans that Senate seat almost certainly. So there's two startling examples, and it seems like that almost all the elections fit that pattern in the 2022 midterms. So that's why Republican politicians are in a full-scale panic about Trump, and we'll see obviously how that goes. But also, Isaac, it must be noted that the great majority of Republican voters are still voting for Kari Lake and Herschel Walker, right?
Well, we have to hold two things at the same time. I think it's fascinating because it shows that in this moment of tribalism, party discipline, and when people will oftentimes, vote for the candidate who has the D or the R next to their name, there are still voters who are making discerning choices about those candidates. At the same time, just as you say, still the overwhelming majority of Republican voters, Democratic voters are choosing just the candidate from that party and are not departing or decamping. And so it's really up to this tiny portion of voters who are making the difference here.
Yeah, I'll just quick editor's note here from my perspective is that whenever we talk about extreme candidates on both sides, there, in my opinion, and factually speaking, there is no such thing at the national level. There's only extreme candidates on the Republican side. The so-called extreme candidates on the Democratic side are actually agree with the American people, according to polling, better than almost any politician does anywhere on the spectrum. So both sides do not do it. The Republicans have clear, obvious, preposterous radicals. The Democrats, if anything, are too conservative. That's my opinion. You don't have to bother responding to that. I know you're journalists. You'll say it's both sides, et cetera. So we'll move on. Okay. So now more amazing facts in your story. So the reality is that it seems like Kari Lake was a true believer, as you explained in the story. And don't we have to give her credit for that? I mean, this is kind of ironic. I think she's totally nuts, but I want to give her credit for being authentically nuts. So the consultants come in, and then I want to talk about the implications of that. The consultants come in according to your piece, and I believe it. And that's why you're on. Is that and they come and tell her, soften up your stances. In the primaries, you're going to be pro-Trump. In the general election, you should be waver on that a little bit. Go grab some, Republican-leaning independents, some of the reluctant Republicans, et cetera. But doesn't that show you? I'm going to go straight to the implication that political consultants are generally full of crap and that they're all trained liars?
Well, there were certainly people who were trying to convince Kari Lake to make tactical decisions to appeal to centrist voters. I also thought it was quite interesting to learn that she, as one of our sources put it, didn't break frame, even in more private one-on-one encounters. there were a raft of pieces, I think, throughout this cycle about candidates who would publicly say "Stop the Steal" and Trump won, and so on and so forth. Any variety of this false messaging, but then privately acknowledge that, of course, the election wasn't stolen. Even other candidates in Arizona, I believe Blake Masters, my newspaper, and others reported that friends of his said that he didn't believe this, but as far as we understand, Kari Lake, even in those kind of private interactions, would hold fast to this false notion that Trump was cheated out of victory in 2020. I, of course, don't know what's in her head, what she truly believes, but this is at least the messaging that she maintained in those kind of private interactions, away from the stage, away from the microphone.
But if you said, look, I can't stand Kari Lake or Blake Masters, and I would argue Kari Lake is more unstable than Blake Masters. Blake Masters is more dangerous. That's an interesting conversation for another time. But if we're talking about who, I don't know, who's more authentic, who we respect more, I don't know if that's the vernacular that makes sense in this context, but one person doesn't break frame, meaning she actually believes it. It wasn't for show. The other person is savvy enough to agree with the consultants that you should break the frame and give a new message during general election. I don't know, is the politician who's lying, isn't he worse than the politician who isn't lying?
Well, there's also a thematic takeaway here about the positions that Republican candidates are boxing themselves into in order to win primaries, and then the way that they're suffering as a result of that in the general election. Arizona is such an interesting example of this because of the small amount of time between the primary election in August and the general election in November. So these candidates adopt these positions to get through the gauntlet of the primary election, these pro-Trump positions. And 2 months, 3 months, it's not enough time to shed this kind of baggage and be a chameleon and convince general election voters that you don't believe the election is stolen, that you don't believe abortion is demonic, so on and so forth. So I don't know about judging between the candidates who are true believers and those who aren't, but I think what some of the results are also showing is that even for those who tried to pivot, who tried to moderate, it wasn't believable in the context of this cycle.
Yeah, well, I mean, but that's what I'm getting at. It wasn't believable because it's not true. They never believed it in the first place. They were liars, and everybody in politics thinks like it's savvy to lie and change your position between the primary and the general election. I don't think it's savvy. I think it's cheesy. I think it's terrible. And so, for whatever else you can say about Kari Lake, and there's a lot of things you can say about Kari Lake, at least she wasn't a liar. I mean that's what's greatly ironic because her position is not true, right? But she genuinely believes the lie, as opposed to Blake Masters, who doesn't believe it at all and was doing it for power and fame and all of that. All right, but I want to move on to a separate, fascinating fact from the piece. You guys say that in her primary, before she got to the general election, the being in favor of Trump, of course, helped. But not only that, taking controversial positions helped because it got her basically $300 million in free media or earned media, and her conservative rival within the Republican primary only got $50 million in free media, which made me go, okay, that leads to two interesting conclusions. One is that's why you need to be controversial, and that's why you're seeing the Marjorie Taylor Greenes, the Matt Gaetz, the Kari Lakes doing what they're doing, because it's getting them the most precious thing in politics, attention. Does that make sense?
I think that's right. The Kari Lake campaign was massively outspent by their rival in the primary, but they had this massive advantage in terms of earned media, free media, and it was an enormous asset for them.
Yeah, so they're not, we call them crazy, but strategically, that's not crazy at all. In fact, if you were, let's say that you're a sane Democrat, you're running in a primary against another Democrat, without actually doing anything that's counterfactual, lying, actually radical, like call for physical action or etc. Shouldn't you be as controversial as you can be if you wanted to be strategically sound and get as much attention to your race as possible?
I think there would certainly be local considerations about the district or the specifics of the race. we saw again that it benefited Kari Lake in the primary, and she paid the price for it in the general election. So all those headlines, all those eyeballs about her more extreme positions may have generated enthusiasm and a sense of energy and momentum, but it also, we've seen, turned off a number of voters. To go back to the initial point in our conversation, some of those 120,000 voters who showed up to vote for the little-known state treasurer candidate, but not in the governor's race.
Yeah, it's a balancing act. But it leads to a second interesting conclusion, which is the media decides who wins. So here's what I mean by that. It's not that the Washington Post or the local Arizona local news station, et cetera, says, vote for this person and that is the correct decision. That's a different topic as to whether they say that subtly or not, right? In this case, what I'm just talking about is, well, if your spending is, $10, $20 million on a race, but the free media is $300 million, well, then the free media, the amount of media you get from however you run your race, is so much more important to whether you're going to get elected than the paid media that you're doing.
It also certainly contributed to the national profile, again, to the sense of momentum. Traveling with the Kari Lake campaign in the final days before the election, this genuinely did have the feel of a presidential style campaign. The crowds, the energy, even the security detail, the way that they were moving around, the media gaggle. And so there was an additive effect there. That was the perception, and so more and more media came, and then that just contributed to it. So there was a certain energy on the campaign, and it was unique. It had something different from other states and other races that drew not just national media but international media. This was something that was commented on by Steve Bannon when he appeared at the rallies in the closing days, and then the media flocking to that scene, I think, just certainly turbocharged that sense and allowed them to say, look at the movement that we've created. Look at the attention and all eyes on Arizona.
Yeah, Isaac, do you know how much Kari Lake spent in the primary?
Oh boy, those exact records I don't have at the tip of my tongue. I know that they were massively outraised and outspent by their primary opponent, Karen Taylor Robson, who really had the backing of the establishment, came from kind of the McCain wing of the party, heavily backed by Doug Ducey. Her own resources, not to mention her own resources. So they certainly were at a financial disadvantage.
So Isaac, my point being that if she got $300 million of free media in just the primary, that probably dwarfed what she spent in paid media by 10 to 20 fold, roughly speaking. Is that fair?
I think that's a fair estimate, though I should say that number was a kind of raw estimate of an advisor, a senior advisor, someone who knew what they were talking about. But it was an after the fact kind of back of the napkin math. It wasn't something that they had pumped through Excel and had determined extremely rigorously.
Yeah, no, I hear you, and we're talking about big broad ranges here. And so in the big picture, though, it does appear for better or for worse, and in the primaries, sometimes for the better, and in general, sometimes for the worse. The reaction you get out of media decides the election, and so that's a phenomenon not often talked about by the media, and so that's interesting. And you saw it in the Kari Lake election, and it worked for her in the primary, and then she lost in the general election because of it. So it's something to keep an eye on, no matter what happens to Kari Lake. And of course, you in the piece talk about how she might be VP. I've been saying that for a long time. She's got Trump VP written all over her. If Trump makes it all the way to January in Iowa, we'll see. Okay, but it
also depends on which media. I mean, so you had national news outlets, local TV stations following her closely on the trail, but you also saw not only in the primary, but into the general, her intense courtship of alternative media, right-wing media. Steve Bannon's radio show has become a kind of must attend, must go destination for candidates courting Trump's endorsement. You saw Steve Bannon advise her in the closing days of the election and then on into the post-election period when she was trying to figure out what to do with this loss. not only Steve Bannon, but Floyd Brown, who runs the Western Journal, an outlet based out in Phoenix. So she cultivated and became part of a whole kind of alternative right-wing media ecosystem, which was extremely important to her celebrity in that ecosystem.
Yes, so you can use right-wing media and mainstream media, and as long as you're not absolutely lunatic, as Kari Lake just barely apparently slipped over the edge, you will probably win. Because she only lost by 17,000 votes. Only 17,000 votes. So a lot of people in Arizona saw that and was like, I don't know who else is running. I know she's running, and she seems, and apparently enough of them thought she looked like a lovely person that she almost won. So whether we like those phenomena or we don't, they are real and they're here. So Isaac Stanley-Becker with a really great piece in the Washington Post about it. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks so much.